So I recently made a tier list and Rex is unironically S tier. I feel like you just don't understand his kit. Damage himself permanently doesn't matter. Okay. I feel like you just aren't comfortable being at 50% for most of your playthrough. Dude, I really have the Eclipse brain on right now. Like, back then, in a situation like that, where I was like a hit away from dying, I'd be freaking out, but now I'm just chilling. Okay, speed doesn't matter.
More than healing, but most of your defensive items should be invested in mobility. Avoiding damage in the first place is always going to be the best option.
Okay, his ability can boost him to wherever. Okay, damage is good. I don't know what you are on about.
Alright, not that much boss DPS, I can tell you that.
Okay, as for Prox is bad, sure, but he's not trash, bro. You trash at Rex. That's the difference. My guy, why are you so pressed about an opinion on the internet? Rest? Sorry. Hardly. I believe Rex has been given an unfair judgment. Ladies and gentlemen, today I present to you why Rex is terrible in Risk of Rain 2. In Eclipse 8 specifically. Now let me preface this by saying that this does not mean Rex is unviable. Every survivor in this game is good enough to be consistent with, but it is a fact that Rex is definitely the worst of the bunch and the hardest to be consistent with. Okay, now we're good to go. So I've decided to make this video not just out of spite, although that is a large contributing factor, but because there are genuinely some people that have no idea why Rex is bad or what Eclipse 8 even is. But today, I'm here to answer those questions. For those who don't know, Eclipse is an alternate game mode where you play on Monsoon, but with modifiers. It's pretty hard. When you beat a level of Eclipse, a new modifier is introduced and stacked on top of the previous modifier. And when you beat that level of Eclipse, another modifier gets introduced and stacked on top of the previous ones. Now this process continues on until you reach Eclipse 8, where you're introduced to this monstrosity. Now these modifiers not only make the game substantially harder, but they also indirectly nerf Rex's kit specifically. The whole game plan of Rex is to manage his resource bar, which is his health. He inflicts damage on himself in exchange for being able to use really powerful and versatile skills, but with the caveat of being able to heal himself with his primary skill, special skill, and his utility skill if you opt to use Bramble Volley instead of Disperse. However, Eclipse 5 adds the modifier of having all your sources of healing, including healing from Rex's skills, and Eclipse 8 adds the modifier of damage being permanent, decreasing your max HP, which also includes self-damage from Rex's skills. So, great. His entire game plan is completely and royally screwed. But surely he has something to make up for it, right? Now that we've gone through an overview of Eclipse 8 and how it affects Rex specifically, let's talk that nerd shit. Stats. Yeah. For Rex's passive ability, he weakens enemies, decreasing their movement speed and damage by 40% and reducing their armor by 30%. It's a pretty nice passive, and it also acts as a debuff that can activate Deathmark. It's pretty good. Now for Rex's primary, Inject, he shoots 3 syringes that each do 80% damage. This is, pretty weak. For reference, Commando, who is also known for being relatively weak, does 100% damage for his primary, which fires roughly 6 bullets a second. Though it is worth noting that Rex can at least weaken enemies with his primary. However, what Commando lacks in damage, he makes up for with Proc. He is one of the best survivors for stuff like stacking bleed, and that is because his primary has a proc coefficient of 1. Okay, now wait a minute, what the hell is a proc coefficient? I highly recommend you check out Cav's video on the topic for more information, but to keep things simple, let's say you have a tri-tip dagger. Now in the game it says that it has a 10% chance to inflict bleed.
No.
This chance is actually multiplied by a hidden value, the proc coefficient. So for a skill with a 1.0 proc coefficient, a tri-tip would have a 10% chance to inflict bleed. But for a skill with a 0.7 proc coefficient, a tri-tip would actually have a 7% chance to inflict bleed. This is basically how it works for all proc-based items with a few exceptions. Okay, so now that we've covered the basics of proc coefficients, let's take a look at the proc coefficient for Rex's primary.
Oh my god!
But wait, it's not all bad. It also heals. Whoa. In case you forgot, healing is halved in Eclipse 8, and it also doesn't really matter as much since damage also decreases max HP. But as garbage as it is, this is basically the main tool you're going to be working with if you end up playing Rex in Eclipse 8. Have fun! Also kind of unrelated, but I wasn't sure where else to fit this. The syringes kind of stagger when you shoot enemies from a distance. They don't really have a high velocity, so you're gonna have to adjust for it, which is kind of annoying. Okay, that's it for his primary. For Rex's secondary skill, you have the option to pick between Seed Barrage and Drill. Seed Barrage is a pretty powerful skill that does 450% damage to an enemy, which is enough to proc bans, some of the best damage items in the game. It also has virtually no cooldown, but despite how good the move is, it's not really a realistic choice for Eclipse 8, since each time you use it, you inflict 15% damage upon yourself. And each time you do this, you lose more max HP. Now this can be negated with the safer spaces, but 450% every 10 seconds is not that great. Not to mention that you need a safer spaces in the first place. Now for Drill, the more realistic choice of the two options, it's a move that is kinda similar to Arrow Rain from Huntress's kit, which is also known for being relatively weak. But unlike Huntress, Rex actually has a way to keep enemies stuck in the entire duration of the attack, which I will get more into later. It also has a much smaller cooldown than Arrow Rain, but it also does less damage as a result. It hits 16 times for 90% damage over the course of 3 seconds, if you can keep an enemy in its radius for the whole duration. And each of the 16 hits has a 0.5 proc coefficient, which is much better than Arrow Rain 0.2 proc coefficient. So the skill is not exactly the worst in the world, even if it removes your ability to reliably proc bans. But then again, Commando can accomplish this in the blink of an eye with Phase Blast, which also has a lower cooldown and more control. For Rex's utility skill, you have the option to pick between Disperse and Bramble Volley. Both do virtually the same thing, knocking enemies back or boosting yourself if you're in the air. This boost can help you reach higher areas or just generally move faster if you're good enough at flicking the camera. It is also sort of momentum based in the sense where if you have a hard light afterburner, you can spam it and move really fast. It can also cancel fall damage, which is pretty important for Eclipse 3's modifier of increasing fall damage and making it lethal. But it is worth noting that after reaching a certain velocity, it no longer cancels it. Now, Bramble Volley has a lot more going for it, such as damage, proc, and healing. But for the same reason as Seed Barrage, this is not really a realistic choice for Eclipse 8, since it does 20% damage to you. And this has much more of a consequence than Seed Barrage, since Rex's utility skill is something you're gonna want to rely on for general movement as well, which means you're probably gonna have to use it a decent amount. For survivors that do have a movement option, Rex's is among the worst. Notably because not only is the move alright at best, but it also has a 5.5 second cooldown. But at least he does have a movement option in the first place, am I right guys? Wait, survivors that don't have a movement option make up for it by having ridiculous powerful versatile options? Well shit. For Rex's special skill, you have the option between Harvest and Tangling Growth. Now unlike the previous skills, both are actually pretty viable in Eclipse 8, though personally, I prefer Tangling Growth. Even though Tangling Growth has a downside of inflicting 25% damage to yourself, it isn't really a move you're gonna want to be spamming or fully relying upon, unlike the secondary and utility skills. And since you're not gonna be spamming this anyways, you can entirely negate this weakness with a safer spaces. The cooldown of Tangling Growth is 12 seconds, so it works out. Plus, there are a lot more upsides in this skill compared to the self-damaging secondary and utility skills. Tangling Growth can completely trap enemies that are caught in its radius, doing 200% damage on impact, and 200% to whichever enemy it pulls. And it heals for 1.5% max HP of every enemy that is trapped. And the whole thing lasts for 8 seconds. This skill right here is what I would consider Rex's only redeemable quality. It is pretty good. This synergizes very well with Drill, since it keeps enemies in place, allowing most of the attack to land on enemies. You can also just straight up knock certain enemies into a hole. There are also certain setups to insta-kill some bosses. The setup to insta-kill the Alloy Worship unit is pretty simple. You just use Tangling Growth behind the pillar on the opposite side from Awu, and since flying enemies take damage when colliding into walls or floors at a really high velocity, Awu can get insta-killed by this, or at the very least take a lot of damage. Harvest is also a viable option for Eclipse 8, but compared to insta-killing Awu and trapping enemies for 8 entire seconds, it's kind of underwhelming. It fires a bolt that deals 330% damage and ejects an enemy, and upon killing them, they drop multiple healing fruits that heal for 25% HP. This healing is really good, but as we've established earlier, healing is kind of in Eclipse 8. You're better off relying on defensive items and just trying not to get hit in general, since every time you do get hit, you lose out on max HP. And this is just my opinion, by the way. I personally think that Rex's primary already has enough healing, but there is no downside to using Harvest if you choose to. So now that we've briefly covered all of Rex's skills, let's summarize why his kit makes him bad for Eclipse 8. Healing sucks, and self-damage does not really work out due to the modifiers of Eclipse 8. His damage is mediocre. For reference, one of Rex's highest damaging skills, Drill, if all hits land on an enemy, which is very unlikely, it would deal 1440% damage. When used on a weakened enemy with, let's say, 20 armor, this would translate to roughly a little under 1600% damage. That is less than 1 chamber of Bandit's Burst Primary. From the front. Yeah, it's not that great. This damage situation is even worse upon the realization that there isn't really a reliable way to proc bans in the early game, unless you're running Seed Barrage for some reason. His mobility is really mediocre and he does not really have anything to make up for it. It's also just kind of awkward to use for general movement, since you have to hit from behind to boost forward. His proc is also terrible. All of the fast shooting stuff, and I say fast shooting in quotation marks, have a proc coefficient of less than 1. I also have yet to mention that he's a pretty big boy, which means a larger hurt box, making it easier to get hit. So with all that being said, aside from Tangling Growth, what does Rex have? Thank you guys for watching this video. I really hope this puts it into perspective why Rex is the worst survivor for Eclipse 8. But let me just quickly reiterate that he's not unviable and not impossible to get consistent with. It might be a lot harder, sure, but it's doable. Anyways, this one took a while to make, so I'd appreciate a like or sub if you made it to the end. Comment down whether you agree or not, or if I just got something blatantly wrong in the video. That's all. See ya.